Hello, welcome to Tips and Tricks, Writing Successful Grant Proposals and Solicitation Responses. We're so happy you're here today with the Colorado Department of Early Childhood to learn more about submitting successful grants. Today you have two trainers with you. My name is Amy Dillon, and you also have my business partner, Amy Diet. We're with Advancing Dynamic Solutions. We were founded in 2018, and we work at the intersection of public health, education, and healthcare to improve outcomes for communities. And one of the things we like to do is write grants. Over the past 20 years, we've obtained millions of dollars in funding from federal, state, and local sources, governments, and foundations. And so we're really happy to share some of our learnings and tips and tricks with you today. We have a resource that will help you through the training. If you go back to the main page that has this recording, you'll also see something that says Create Note Taker here. If you've moved away from that web page, we do have a tiny URL at the top that you can utilize to get back there. Once you're on that website, you'll be able to see a button that says Create Note Taker here. When you click on that, it's going to open up a Google document and it'll ask you to make a copy. This will allow you to make your very own copy of a note taker that we have. I'm going to open that up real quick so you can see what that looks like. So here is our note taker. And essentially, it will walk you through each of the sections of our training. So we've pre-populated links and helpful tips throughout the training. The nice thing is when you make your very own copy, you can add your own text and information too. So this is now your very own version that you'll have for yourself. So feel free to utilize that as we go along with our training today. Before we jump in, there's a few terms we want to talk about. Within the grant writing space, within the proposal space, there's lots of terms that can kind of be confusing and sometimes are used interchangeably. So one of the things we talk about are grants. Oftentimes they come from either government or foundations. And again, those are dollars that you typically write a submission to get funding for. Another thing it might be called is a project or program solicitation. This oftentimes comes from the government, and it's really they are soliciting or asking for people to submit to either provide goods or services to the government. Two other common terms are requests for proposals or request for applications, or RFPs or RFAs. And those can come from multiple different sources. But essentially, someone is asking you to submit a proposal to implement either a program, some type of project, etc. Typically, the differentiation between these, at least at the government level, is the amount of money threshold that it has. Also, we're going to show you a few different resources that come from the state. They may refer to people who are applying as a vendor. So you may not think of yourself as that in your traditional sense of your word if you work at a nonprofit organization or for the government, but that might be a term that you're referred to because you would be providing that good or that service. Another thing to think about when we're writing grants is there are some fiscal year considerations. Typically, when you look at state funding, it's going to run from July 1 to June 30th, since that's the state fiscal year. For the federal level, you're going to see typically proposals come out from October 1st to September 30th, since that's the federal fiscal year. And then, of course, you have your typical calendar year, or what might be your organizational year, from January 1st to December 31st. We bring this up because as you're thinking about writing grants in the future, you really want to think about the timeline that you're submitting your proposal for, when you're going to do the work, and what your budget's going to look like. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit as well. One of the things when we started doing this grant writing training is people really wanted to know more about how do I actually find funding opportunities. In your note taker, you're also going to find that we put a number of different resources for you to be able to see where you can find different opportunities. So we have a little table that has state funding, where you can find some federal opportunities and local foundations. So click on those links, those will be really helpful for you. As you'll see in this chart here, one of the interesting things about the state of Colorado is that procurement, or how they ask for people to submit to either do a program or a project or provide a service, is decentralized. So that means all state government agencies kind of do their own thing in regards to putting out how they would ask people to propose for things. One of the best places to start, however, is looking at doing business with the state of Colorado. This link is in your note taker, and you'll see there's 3 important steps if you want to start to either have a grant or other type of project with the state. As with anything, you want to start with your research. So this is really helpful for you that might want to know more about how to sign up for different systems, the different types of agreements that are available, what's been awarded in the past. After you get a little bit of research under your belt, you're going to want to register. Colorado uses something called Colorado VSS. This is where most state agencies will post their solicitations. As I just mentioned, though, because procurement is done independently by each state agency, sometimes they won't be on VSS, but it's a good place to sign up anyway because you can see a lot of different opportunities there. And then lastly, you'll have the access page, and we're going to review a few more of these at the end of our training today, but we just wanted to show you that this is a good place to start with looking for funding opportunities. Throughout the training, we're going to give you an opportunity to pause. One of the things we learned about writing grants is you have to practice. And so we want to give you just a little bit of time to practice some things on your own. So we're going to have a few of these your turn opportunities throughout the recording today. So what we're going to do is we're going to invite you to open up the note taker that you have and look through the different funding opportunities. You're going to then click on the CDHS, or the Colorado Department of Human Services procurement link. Look through the current solicitation opportunities they have there. CDHS is interesting in that they post their procurement both on that website and VSS that we just talked about. Pick one as an example and look at the associated files. So you're going to come here and then open procurement, and then you'll have an opportunity to look at that yourself as well. So we'll give you the chance here just to pause for a moment and do that quick activity.
Helpful tips. We are going to give you some of the top tips that we use when we write grants. The first is to read the request for proposal, or RFP, document carefully and create a checklist of everything required. This may sound intuitive, but if you plan ahead, it really helps. Grant applications can be a lot to read through and honestly overwhelming at first. So when you're looking through the RFP, there's a few questions you want to ask yourself. Are you eligible, and can you meet the grant conditions? What's the timeline? What's the budget? Is there a match required? Is the purpose or program a fit for your organization? And do you have the right staff and qualifications to implement those programs? And is it worth the time and effort? Are you able to invest the necessary resources, so really the time and staffing, to write the grant application? If you answer yes to those questions, get yourself organized. We like to create a checklist. This also helps determine what is mandatory and what is preferred. This is not a requirement by any means, but it really helps you plan ahead and distills that long document into a tangible resource. You can see an example that we have included in the note taker here of a checklist we created for a federal grant. When you plan backwards from when you need to submit, you have an accurate timeline for yourself, and that checklist really helps with that. All in all, think of the grant writing process like a puzzle, and the pieces and parts of where it might fit best to get your message across. The RFPs can be hard to decode, but that checklist can help and get organized for yourself. The second tip is to start early. Approval processes can take time, and your narrative may need time for your leadership to review. Some grants also require a commitment or a letter of support from maybe your board, maybe a community partner, etc. So make sure you have the time you need to get all those pieces completed. Number 3, determine an approach that matches the grant focus area, allowable uses for funds, and uses best practices. All in all, a grant narrative really needs to flow and connect the needs statement to the program goals, to the activities you will do to carry out those goals. You want to make it clear to the reviewer throughout your narrative how your work will further the purpose and goals of that grant application or solicitation. Number 4, if available, utilize the evaluation criteria or rubric as the guide to writing your narrative. Not all grants or solicitations will include a rubric, but if they do, answer the questions and score yourself. You can also look at the various point levels that's set for each section to make sure you answer those parts fully. Number 5, communicate clearly and concisely. You want a narrative that is free of jargon, limits acronyms, is consistent with the language in the grant application, builds a case for why resources are needed, avoids assumptions, is grammatically correct, and uses the format provided and the given headings. Reviewers may or may not have the deep expertise in your topic area, so that's something to keep in mind. Format matters. Use the headings and sections and follow it exactly. You're making it easier for the reviewer to align your response with the question and section as they're scoring it. Language to use. Often there are a number of words are used to describe the same or similar concept, and they can really be interchangeable. So just make sure you're consistent with the language that you use in your narrative and what the RFP uses throughout the proposal. So if it's a goal or objective, an outcome or result, a benchmark or milestone, measure or indicator, just stay consistent throughout. Number 6, match your budget request with your objectives and work plan. This is very important. If you want to be able to pay for something, make sure that it ties to the work plan either as an objective or an activity. For example, don't put in training materials in your budget if you do not have an activity throughout your narrative about providing a training. Number 7, follow all directions and requirements exactly and submit by the deadline. So again, follow the format, use the headings and sections that they give, and make sure to follow those simple instructions like font, the size, the margins. It really does matter. And if possible, try to submit a little earlier than the deadline. Try to avoid the last minute submission process.
All right. So those were some of our top tips we just wanted to kick off the training with. Now we're going to go into a little bit of a deep dive into sections of a grant that are pretty common. So we're going to look first at organizational background, a project description and needs assessment, SMART or SMARTY objectives. We're also going to dig into some work plan development, measurement and evaluation, budget and budget narrative, and attachments and letters of support. So our first one we're going to look at is your organization overview. When you're writing a grant application, you'll likely need to describe your organization's qualifications, your background, and your experience. The purpose of this is typically to show that your organization can carry out what you intend to do in the grant with the funds that you're asking for. So this really just shows that you have the experience that's needed. What we would say is write this section as though the reader or the reviewer really knows nothing about your organization or the program you're proposing, because they might not. Don't think about this as dumbing it down, but really making it crystal clear about what your organization does. On this slide, you'll see we have pulled a section from a real grant that this was the actual question that was asked. Share your organization or agency name and type, and a brief background on your work. We put an example in both here on the slide as well as in your note taker, so you can see some of the headings that you might want to start with if you're providing an overview on your agency. One thing you'll notice is oftentimes sentences are sort of short with this. And that's actually really helpful for a reviewer, is to keep your sentences short and succinct and clear. Again, the person may not know anything about your organization, so the clearer you can be with what you're writing, the more helpful that will be for reviewers.
Next is project description and needs assessment. This section of your proposal details why your project is needed, ideally utilizing data to clearly articulate the gaps you're working to fill and an overview of how your project will be carried out. The project description highlights how your project will be implemented, what will be accomplished, and what the outcomes will be, all framed around RFP interests and goals. You want to make sure you're stating the case and using local data when possible, that you're clearly articulating gaps, that there is a description of your proposed project needs that directly then relate to a work plan, which we'll talk about in a minute, and confirm mandatory requirements or criteria that's listed in the RFP or RFA are met. We wanted to then share some examples of local data that's available. So this comes from the Colorado Department of Early Childhood. And if you click on available data here, and again, these links are included in your note taker, and you click on this picture of the dashboard, it opens up an opportunity where you are able to find more local data. So for example, if we want to look at early childhood education professionals, you can click there and it'll actually open up a map where you can really drill down to your region or area. I just wanted to provide that example. Like I said, there are other examples of data sources on the note taker. We have also included on page 3 of the note taker a sample project needs assessment. So before we go into that, this will be one of the your turn. You can look at the example data sources listed in your note taker. Maybe pick one source and find a data point, information, or other fact that is new to you. And in that note taker, you'll see that sample project needs assessment description. I do want to note that we utilize trauma-informed approaches in our work at AD Solutions, especially when using suicide data. So as you look through this project description, if needed, we've also included support like the Colorado Crisis Services line. But we provided that example for you.
All right, hopefully you had an opportunity to pause and look into some of the example data sources that are available to you, and also look through that example data that we have in your note taker as well. Next, we're going to talk about SMART objectives, SMART goals, sometimes called those things interchangeably, but oftentimes they're a focus of your grant to be able to show clearly what you're trying to accomplish or work on. Let's talk a little bit about those SMART objectives. So typically you're going to see something that stands for SMART. S oftentimes stands for specific, but some people also use the word strategic. M, we've always seen it be measurable. A can mean a lot of different things. We like to use attainable, but you can also use ambitious, achievable, or action-oriented. R, we use relevant, but you can also use realistic. And T, we always see it stand for time-bound. When we're looking at writing a SMART objective for a grant, this really helps us to focus on specifically what we're going to do. So for example, here with specific, what are we doing and for whom? Let's say, for example, we're going to provide a training for Region 8 on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then we're going to think about measurement. How will we measure and how will we know it's been done? We're going to do 2 trainings for up to 50 people. Attainable, we're really going to analyze, can this be done? So we're going to say, yep, trainings are feasible by the end of the year if resources are obtained. Is this relevant? Will this have an effect on the desired change? What we'd like to see is an increase in skills and knowledge, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion under our specific part. And then time bound, when will it be completed? So we're going to look for this to be completed by December 2023. Once we have all of that together, we're going to frame that into a sentence that looks like this. By December 2023, Advancing Dynamic Solutions will implement 2 trainings to increase knowledge and skills related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in early childhood education for at least 50 participants in Region 8. So by us putting those different factors into that chart that we just saw previously, we know we've hit on all of those major pieces and parts and have a clear objective. We always like starting with the date just because that makes it really concrete for people to know the time for which you're doing it, but you'll see the rest of the elements of the SMART objective are included. A newer thing that we're really looking at is SMARTY goals. And what SMARTY goals add to the other pieces of the SMART objective are the ideas of inclusivity and being equitable. So really thinking, does this work? Will it bring support to those who have been unjustly impacted in a way that shares power? For equity, does this work address systemic injustice, inequity, or oppression? So many grants we're seeing now really are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. In your note taker, we do have a link to some resources related to equity. So if you want to dig deeper into that topic, we would love for you to do so. So check out your note taker for those resources.
Next is work plan development. This is really important for the how. You're usually asked to list your goals or that SMART objective and how you will achieve them through specific activities and tasks within what time period, who is responsible, and what the measurement will be to know you completed that task. It can also be called a scope of work or an action plan. Either way, it is usually requested within a specific template. So make sure you're using the template that they give you. And regardless of that template, make sure you are getting the picture across to the reviewer, even if it's not perfect. If you are clear and organized, to let the reviewers know what you are doing, you'll be okay. So when you see a work plan, one of the hardest pieces of grant writing is determining the right level and level setting. So this is a very simple action plan template that can be included in a grant proposal. So make sure you have sequential activities that can follow your objective. Then you're on the right track. Really picture it as a funnel of big picture to actions of how. So you're really looking at what are you going to do? So again, the tasks and actions, the timeline, how long, make it realistic, and the measurement. How will you know the deliverable or task has been completed? In your note taker on page 4, you will see an example of a work plan template that's actually used by the Colorado Department of Human Services. So we can show you that. So we filled in a sample for you here. We can see we put in a SMART objective, and then for each key activity, wrote down tasks, a time period, the deliverable, the measurement, and the person responsible. So we are going to invite you to pause and take a look at that work plan and really review it for the following. Is the outcome statement SMART? Is the table completed fully? Do activities start with action verbs? Are activities sequential? Are the activities related to and will help accomplish that stated objective? And no use of acronyms if possible in the work plan.
So thanks for digging into that work plan. Hopefully you had some time during that pause to look through that and see all the different pieces and parts of a work plan. It's a really essential piece of a grant typically to show the work that you're doing. Next, we're going to talk just a little bit about measurement and evaluation. Oftentimes grants specifically ask for what your organization's overall approach is to evaluation and how you're going to specifically measure what you're going to work on for the grant. This usually looks at an approach to evaluation. It may request how you'll measure the impact as well of your program or effort. So there's a few different ways that you might want to talk about your evaluation or measurement of your program. First might be, how are you assessing things? So this is typically going to be more process oriented. It's how you're forming your work or planning your work. Oftentimes you're looking at what your strengths are, your weaknesses are, the ways to improve. And oftentimes this type of process piece is going to be repeated over time. So that's assessing really where you are, what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you can improve. Evaluation is usually going to be a little bit more outcome oriented, summative, or at the end, or the overall result. If you're going to show what has been learned or what's changed, and is oftentimes completed at the end of a phase or after a program has been implemented. So there's a lot of crossover between these two types of data, but both really require you to have some type of data or information, some type of criteria for you to look at, and they're analyzed for understanding. You may also know that there are two different types of methods oftentimes used for evaluating, and you might want to talk about this when you're writing your grant application. But quantitative is usually counting something, how much or how many. It typically deals in numbers and looks at what can be counted or measured specifically. Oftentimes this could be looked at as a little bit more objective because you're counting something and kind of utilizing that statistical analysis piece. So this might be a survey or other type of data analytics that count how many people have done something, how much has something changed. Qualitative then really describes something. Why and how is this happening? It's really more about people's experiences and drawing meaning from their stories. One of the things that's wonderful about qualitative information is people do love stories. That's going to really be the piece that is more helpful to just have people really get a picture of what you're doing. Oftentimes this information can be collected from focus groups or interviews from those that you're working with. What you might want to put in your application is how you're going to use potentially both of these types of things. Can you have a survey where you also talk to some people? So you have some numbers of what you're doing along with a case study or a story. Those are always going to be the most impactful things. So if you can talk about that in your application, about how you're going to do those things, that would be great. A couple of the examples of what we like to do some online surveys. We oftentimes will track participation. How many people came to something? How many meetings did we have? That just shows progress as well. As we mentioned, discussion or focus groups, in-depth interviews, and then oftentimes what you're really finding there are what are the themes? What are the common things that you've heard so that you can share back with your funders? So you'll let them know you're going to collect those themes as well. So these are some things that you might want to talk about or think about when you're going to put your grant together. How are you going to do some of these things to show the success that you've had?
Next, we're going to talk about sustainability. Funders often want to know how you will sustain efforts past grant funding. We know sustainability may not be a realistic ask, yet it's asked all the time. So frequently you may feel there's no other realistic answer than continue to raise funds or more grant funding. And this may be frustrating, yet you may come across this. So what we'd recommend to respond to a sustainability question is to really consider what partnerships, policies, processes, or even structures that can be implemented to maintain that program or effort past grant funding. So you're looking at the policy, the system, or the environmental impact or level that can continue. So instead of saying, we need more grant funding, really think about beyond the income. What's the human capital? Look at the trainings that were provided. Are there knowledge, skills, or staffing that will sustain? What in-kind supports can you provide to sustain some of these programs? And what systems may last beyond funding? Next is budget narrative and budget. When you're planning the budget, first look at what is allowable versus what is non-allowable. For example, in the RFA or the RFP, you may see that you cannot include meals, for example, at a training or a meeting. So make sure you're not then asking for that in the budget. Also look for if there's a match required, because you will have to explain where that match is coming from, and also consider the timeline. When you're looking at the budget narrative, especially, be specific. The more detailed, the better. Try to show your calculations for how you got to that number and ensure it ties to your objective. Use the template requested. Often you will see a budget template that they want you to use. You must use that, even if it's in a format that's not friendly for you. Read the instructions closely that are tied to that template. Every budget item should be clearly linked to an objective or an action or a task in your work plan. Include realistic budget figures that are clearly explained yet concise, and check your calculations. We have an example here where it's okay to say, and we know we need $1,500 for a conference expenses for 2 staff members, but it can be even stronger. So provide this level of detail. The training is motivational interviewing, professional development for 2 staff members at $1,500, which includes registration costs for $200 per each staff member, which is $400 total. The flight costs are $250 per staff member, which is $500 total. The hotel costs $150 a night times 2 nights times 2 rooms, $600. So really show the specificity when possible.
Last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about attachments and letters of support. So when we had you do an activity earlier, we had you open up an example of the Colorado Department of Human Services piece, and you might have seen all kinds of different folders. Oftentimes, grants are going to ask for a number of attachments. It might be a board of directors list. It might be some tax information. It might be a recent audit. It might be some policies or practices you have, like an anti-discrimination statement. Might ask who the staff are. Might be your annual report. Might be evaluation reports. So lots of different things can be attachments, and it really varies based on the grant or the RFP that comes out. But what we're going to say is start this early. We really want you to make sure that you're looking at getting those things done soon. Letters of support may also be asked for. This is particularly for grants where there's going to be some type of partnership involved. So say you need to work with a local mental health center or school district or another early childhood center. Making sure that you have those ready early is good. So we're going to ask you to open up your note taker. And if you scroll down to the section kind of very at the end called Attachments and Letters of Support, we want you to review the draft letter that we have. One of the things we always recommend is that if you are asked to submit letters of support and you're going to ask a partner to do so, start them with a draft letter. It's a lot easier than saying, hey, will you write me a letter? And then having to go back and forth on what the letter should include. So make sure you start that. So when it's your turn here, review that draft letter and then just consider what might you ask for from a partner for a letter as an example. So go ahead and pause and look at that. All right. So a few more considerations that you might want to think about for attachments and letters of support is they're often listed last in the RFP or whatever proposal documents there are, but oftentimes they can take the longest amount of time to gather and put together. Identify if signatures are needed in the process to get them. I used to work in a school district, and oftentimes then getting something that was either signed by the superintendent or the board could take quite a bit of time. So I always started that right away. Identify the partners needed and begin outreach early, as we mentioned. And then, just as you did with your turn there, digging through that letter, provide that guidance or template and give at least 2 weeks. Here we have an example of what a rubric might look like. So as we mentioned in the tips above, your proposal is going to be scored typically by reviewers. Sometimes the actual RFP includes what the scoring criteria is, and sometimes it doesn't. So it just really depends. But we wanted to show you this is that typically what a reviewer is going to get is really specific items that tie directly back to the question that you were asked in the RFP. So when you're writing a narrative, always make sure that you go back to exactly what they're asking for and answer the question precisely as what they're asking for in that section. Sometimes it feels like you can be repeating yourself a little bit, but try to really be distinct with specifically what they're asking in that question. A few additional considerations to wrap us up here. Submission tips. Always conduct a final review. If you have someone who is willing to review the grant for you as if they're a reviewer, that's always helpful as well. I know that's a big ask for somebody, but that has been helpful for us in the past. Start your submission process early. As Amy mentioned, sometimes things can happen, like internet goes down, that type of thing. So make sure you have that ready to go. This is probably the tip that we heard most commonly when we worked with state government on what are some of the challenges they see with submissions that come in, is that people just didn't follow the directions exactly. So follow the directions exactly. That can be hard when you're digging through a 30, 40, 50 page proposal document, but really make sure you're doing that. That's why that checklist we showed you earlier can help, because it can really help you to find what those directions are and how to submit. Double check all required attachments are included. Follow-up and feedback. You are able to request feedback on your submission, particularly from government agencies. So they should be tracking any scores they have, any feedback they had from reviewers, and that could really help you if you're early on in the grant writing process to learn more about what kind of feedback you're getting. And remember, try again. Oftentimes when you're submitting a grant, it's competitive. They might have only so much money and only be giving out a few awards. So you may have written a great grant, but they were only limited in the funds they could give out. So don't be discouraged if you don't get the first grant you try, or even the 10th grant you try, because sometimes that's just how the process goes.
Great. Now we're going to look at resources. Make sure to ask questions. The RFP or the RFA can be confusing sometimes, but most have a Q&A process where you can submit questions, and that's usually listed on that RFP or RFA. If you have a question, most likely someone else does too. So take advantage of that Q&A process to submit any questions you may have. Then we'd recommend reviewing the Q&A document that is released after that timeline for the Q&A. The Q&A will close at a specific time period, and take a look at that so you can see all the questions that were asked and the answers that were given prior to submitting your proposal. Another note is to provide feedback. So the Colorado Department of Human Services is working to improve their bid process right now. If you look at your note taker on the last page, there is a link to a feedback form for the Department of Human Services procurement process where you can add feedback. And last but not least, agency program and staff contacts are often also listed on that RFP or RFA. So reach out with questions before, maybe to see if it makes sense for you to apply, during, and/or after of submission. Some additional resources that could be helpful. If you go back to that link of doing business with the state, there are some wonderful resources here for you. So you're going to scroll down to these blue bars, and under additional state and higher education resources, kind of right towards the middle, there's the Minority Business Office. This provides some wonderful resources for organizations around grant writing for free. The other one that we just recommend taking a closer look at is under the Business Assistance Resources. And if you look at the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC, That will actually provide assistance to you. They will read the RFP that you're responding to and your proposal, and will even provide some support at no charge. So feel free to take advantage of those resources. They are there for you. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this recording and the training. We also hope that you took advantage of that note taker. So this was tips and tricks, writing successful grant proposals and solicitation responses. And this is Amy and Amy signing off. Thank you.